My name is Taylor Payton. I am the assistant to the art director, Kate Sears-Patowski, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artist discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and art professionals on current issues that engage them. This afternoon, I'm excited to welcome artists Michelle Grabner and Christina Catherine Martinez to the Dialogue stage for the 7th Annual Art Critics Forum. In addition to fostering beloved studio practices, Michelle in painting and sculpture, and Christina in performance and film, our two panelists are also talented publishing art critics. Moderated by Tessa Solomon, an associate editor at ARTnews, the Art Critics Forum will consider the tradition of artist as critic, exploring the relationship between making and critique in Michelle and Christina's practices. I'll now welcome Tessa and Michelle and Christina to the stage. I was nervous, so I was just reading.
We were told to talk very close to the mic. Okay, thanks for being here. Thanks to the panelists. We're here to talk about artists and performers who also write about art. It's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but as a writer who's just a writer and very rarely on a stage, if ever, I think it's just endlessly fascinating. You know, who we are and what we know is basically what, to speak very generally, determines our reviews. And what an artist knows, what a performer knows, is going to be different than what just a writer knows. They're going to see the art in a new way. They're going to understand the process. And that is something I'm very interested to learn about. And this is going to sound a little pessimistic. Being a critic and being an artist just on their own is hard. You have a lot of work to do and no promise that that work is going to be, read, be reviewed, be financially lucrative. But we do it anyway. And I'm very interested, again, to hear why. Right. So I think it'd be good to start at the start. And what was your first, I want to say memorable piece of crit that you read?
Go for it. Me? Okay. I will just say that my path to all of these things has been a bit odd.
Always sideways.
Yeah, always sideways. I didn't, like most, I didn't really dream about becoming an art critic when I was a little girl. I didn't receive a play art critic set from my parents. I was actually working at a fashion magazine and I didn't find it very fulfilling. And someone just said, maybe you should try writing about art. And unfortunately, I fell in love with that. But I think it was the first time reading a book called Humiliation by Wayne Kestenbaum. And by that time, I was already I had a staff job at a website called Artslant that is no longer with us. But, and I was very much struggling to find my voice. And the first thing that I did, which is I think a lot of younger writers do in art writing, which is try to parrot international art English and use a lot of multisyllabic Latinate terms to say things like, I like it. Wayne Kestenbaum is a poet who also writes about art, and he wrote a really wonderful book called Humiliation about that. And there was a moment at the end, a piece at the end, which is just a complete list of all of his most painful professional humiliations. So he talked about all the reviews he did that got bad responses. He listed all of the things, maybe artist essays or exhibition catalog essays that he wrote that the artists hated. That was my first time realizing that you don't have to just try and be smart or say the smart thing, and that being human in that kind of work can be really, really interesting and more, I guess productive maybe is not the right word, but just expansive. Yeah.
Takes confidence though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this will be familiar to many of you. I was an undergrad and BFA at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I had an art history professor who was also the editor of New Art Examiner. And I remember writing a Philip Pearlstein paper for the class, and he pulled me aside and said, "Would you like to write reviews for New Art Examiner?" I never saw that coming. Writing is a painful process for me, but it was a way for me to kind of assess and think through the constraints of my own practice. So that's very important. And, stepping in then to an MA in art history, I keep going back to an essay I shared with you, Christina, by Tom Lawson called Last Exit Painting. It was from 1981. And it was polemical. I mean, he was really pushing at the idea of a kind of painting coming from photo-based images, and he's and an artist himself. And so he was using his own work as an example, using people like Walter Robinson as an example as well. And that was important to me. So, and then there was that academic criticism that was happening. And I had a conversation with Hal Foster last week, and I reminded him how important the anti-aesthetic was in my formation as a critic, and that I probably wouldn't be talking to him if it wasn't for that. So that is a more straightforward path than your circuitous path.
And speaking of which, and I don't tell Hal, but a nice comment that I got early on in this mode of like thinking about my own subjectivity and whenever I write about art is someone also like not everyone should write this way. Art criticism would be terrible if everyone did what I did. So there's diversity, but someone made a comment like, "Oh, I appreciate how subjective you are in your work because sometimes it's hard to feel the stakes when everything's just a theme." And he, as an example, he said, like Hal Foster writes about fear, but what is Hal Foster afraid of?
Everything.
Okay, good. Then we know.
Well, since you're here, I always like asking other writers, crit is not, often it's not journalism, but it's a very specific part of journalism. You can't exactly get it wrong, but you can get people mad. You can show that you were uninformed. And you can also show maybe a little too much of yourself in a way, because it is informed opinions. And I don't know about you two, and this is what I'm going to ask. Do you ever have to kind of check yourselves a little bit? Because like I said earlier, we walk into every review with our entire world, our entire perspective, and you want to be objective, but at the same time, you are doing something so fundamentally not, or you want to be objective, yeah, but you're doing something just subjective. So how do you wrestle like that? Do you have to check yourself and your own personal histories? No, that's a no.
I just don't. I feel that impetus, but women and women writers and women working in culture industries we're already been socially hardwired to check ourselves. So I'm But and I will say that when I write something, I used to be kind of batted around by what was exactly happening or what's the purpose of what I do besides that. And someone asked, is it serving my career or is it serving the work? Is it serving, what do I write for? And I said something which is maybe a bit risky, which is that it's serving the work, not even necessarily the work of art that I'm writing about, but it's serving the work, which is like the piece that I'm writing. And I think that necessarily entails due diligence to being as informed as possible about the work and the artist and what I'm doing. But, I'm serving and maybe that's where the attitude of being able to own the creation of criticism as a piece of work is, I'm serving that. So if there comes a sort of conflict in sort of what I'm doing, that tends to be what comes first, which is in a way almost like serving, the reader comes first.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I am on the other end of I. I won't use I. It's the how and the what, and it's the obligation to description. Description is always the first form of criticism for me, and to get it accurate, and to get it detailed and to use language the best way as possible. So I have a pure allergy to any kind of autobiographical or self-expression within language. And it's because I'm not good with language. I'm not excellent enough with using the form to be able to intertwine it in a way that is necessary when one is doing that kind of assessment of work. So so I am dull by comparison. I am not funny. What I'm learning over the years is that I have accrued a deep depth of historical knowledge. I've just been in the world a lot. I just finished a Chris Williams review, and speaking about and speaking to and looking at and analyzing his work and the German middle class. I understand that. We were talking about that, decades ago. And so it was really interesting to be able to see that, oh, I got those wheels. Like I understand that where, a lot of conversations I have, that's just a blind spot. So that is what I can lean into. A kind of my responsibility is to, the histories and the research and to keep myself as far back and as far out of it as possible. It is very dull, dense, condensed writing. Not nearly as
Were you an artist first before you got? Would you consider? Yeah. So
Yes.
we came from like the opposite
Yes.
entry points, but sort of met in the middle. I've identified mainly exclusively as a writer for a very long time before the performing and the artistic practice and everything came into it.
What about as artists? Do you ever look at a work and I know you were just saying you throw yourself to the back seat, but you are looking at art. It never strikes you like looking at the process. Maybe I do that way. Maybe you think about how it would relate to your own work. You even as identities as a visual artist, as a performer, you even have to put that to the side, or does that come into play at all?
It comes in later because also when we say like performance practice, that's just my work as a stand-up comedian, which is something I started doing almost 10 years ago now as like a hobby, as a way of sort of getting some relief outside the art world, and then that became part of my career, and then it kind of looped back in, and now it's a performance practice. But I thought about this a lot. There is a time when like the critic, for me, what I love about doing comedy is like it does have to be a place, and in some sense I felt like I had to leave the art world in order to learn how to be an artist because I was so entrenched in these mores. It really does just come from a place of sort of joy, and it's very personal and it's very subjective, and it's very geared toward this thing called entertainment, which is an easier concept to work toward than thinking about what am I doing in the vast context of performance art. But then, there's a point at which it has to be put away so that I can just follow an impulse. But then it's critic part always comes back later to think about like why something did or didn't work. And that's been the case with almost every other part of what I do. There's a point at which it has to leave, and then there's a point at which it has to come back.
So Tessa, form that question again for me.
Sure. So I'd asked originally about kind of like who we are, and I know we were talking earlier about how identity, you do get pigeonholed sometimes, like, oh, because you are something, go write about that thing that's like you, kind of. But as just pure artists, do you ever feel like your process, how you think about art, how you would interact with maybe those same materials, does that ever come into play? Or do you put like, you've taken the artist hat off on the shelf, you're just a writer?
Sure. Okay. That's a complicated question. And it's complicated by the fact that I have hung on to a handful of tenants in this studio for a long time. And again, I've been around for decades making work, and those tenants kind of come and go, right? So I think at no time, sometimes I guess I get excited about work that has a kind of parallel track or starts to think about repetition or predictability. But I think I'm at my best when I'm cast much farther than that. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the constraints I put on my studio practice, they can only be tight constraints by the fact that I am writing and assessing and interpreting all kinds of cultural production. including curating as a practice. So I often think that my curatorial practice is very critical in that. So I think that, it's, the obligation I have to writing criticism, I do feel it as a responsibility and obligation, sure, to criticism itself, but also to my own practice. But it's a very different kind of assessment. So, it's language based. It deals with history, and it's assessing different ideas very differently than what I'm doing in the studio.
Sorry, I'm trying to think about just thinking about like criticism. I feel like I answered the question in the opposite way, but I'm just thinking about like criticism as practice, which I think is what this thing is about. This panel is titled, and for me, it sort of has become a lot more integrated or infused in different things. So, when I think about, there's certain things in the process where like the criticism hat has to be taken away, but then there's also many ways in which like the work is criticism in terms of performance. I did a performance at Mocha in Los Angeles based on a character I created named Stephanie, and she's a artist PR agent. That was a character created out of 10 years of receiving lots and lots of different press releases. So I kind of like took all that language and put it together and made this persona that then, I would do in comedy context. And then Mocha invited me to give a walkthrough of their Tala Madani show in character as Stephanie. So it's not something I could ever anticipate, but I guess for me, what I do and when it's done at its best, there's not so much of a separation. The criticism is the work, even if it's not a text or a piece of writing.
I mean, a really good piece of crit. I mean, we study it. Like we look at it as if it's kind of poetry, at least the best of it. But how do you start with a review? Because everybody I know, I mean, I have some coworkers that, they'll go to the show and they'll get it out that day. I have some that will sit there like me and think for a few days and then get bothered that I need to file. Yeah. So what about you?
Oh, I have a very specific process, which is one, I'll never think about what it is at the opening because there's just no room. And I really regret the disappearance of the paper checklist that happened during the pandemic, because my process it's very specific. I like to walk through the show with a checklist and just jot down the first impressions that I have, especially in relation to specific works. And it might just be words or phrases. It could be really, sometimes I might feel something and then I'll end up, writing a bunch of chicken scratch on the back of a press release. But just walking through the show with a piece of paper to scratch on is important, because then it takes away the intimidation of the blank page when I'm at home and, the blinking cursor. So it starts for me just with a bunch of really messy handwritten notes. And then once I just get those into a word processing document, then I let those sit for a day or two before I can think about it again. But I rarely, if I'm going to view a show, know that I'm reviewing it, I'll spend a lot of time there. So it's rare that I felt like I need to come back in the middle of working on a review. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I start from those very far outer edges, and I start to identify power structures and signifiers of authority, right? Where is this exhibition, right? And we can start with a cultural capital. We can think about the gallery or the institution. So start kind of peeling away those power structures. First of all, I have to know them before I can go close and do a deep dive into the work or the conceit of an exhibition. So I start out at that far edge of figuring out where my assignment is or what I'm choosing to write about. How does it live within a broader cultural world with authorities and hierarchies?
Is this you thinking, or are you doing research?
A little bit of both. I would have to say that kind of initially, it, right? Yeah. You know how it is if you get an art form assignment, or if I'm even doing an interview for BOM, and interviews are a form of criticism as well. Really starting to figure out, again, where does power live? Because that that is important, not necessarily to the work or to the practice, but to the framing of it. And once work comes out into the world, it becomes a social entity. And that kind of social entity needs to be addressed, right? So finding out within the social structure where power lives. So very important to me. Then I'll often go, I typically think deeply, kind of, again, that what I was saying earlier, how important description is. Really look closely, make notes of surfaces, those little cracks, those little in-betweens that really are maybe even intentionally being hidden from exhibition. But that is our obligation, to seek them out. So that's very important. And then I'll often step back again before I start the writing and move into literary criticism or philosophy. So I'll start to kind of move in those systems of analysis and thinking. And see if any of those make sense now as a way of potentially not only just not giving context to the work, but expanding it, thinking about it differently. And then it's the painful sitting down and penning it out. And again, the form is very different depending on who I'm writing for. So Extra, who we both have written for in the past, we're looking at 8,000 words for Extra. That is a long form review often. Art form is very tight for me. Interview is very different. So, and I'm also just said that the back end of it, I am absolutely 100% trustworthy of editors. I do not wrestle sentences back from editors. Not my interest at all. Absolutely not. They do what they need to do.
I fight so hard.
Yeah,
Wait, I have a little question. Someone asked me.
Don't email me.
Okay. Someone asked me at one point, like, how do you get away with what you do? Sometimes in art form, especially, or some more like traditional publications. And I'm like, editors are just people. And I was like, you can fight back, and not for the sake of fighting back. I have found that. And I think this also comes from me identifying more strongly, or identifying maybe just for a longer amount of time as a writer. Like, I will fight over sentences. And sometimes I, find that, okay, they're making a point that I'm missing. But sometimes also in fighting for what I'm trying to say, or specifically the way I'm trying to say it, because talk about criticism as practice. Like, I think written style is a big part of my criticism. Yes. So I will fight back. In fighting back, it does force me to articulate my terms more clearly. Yes. So it can't, it's never, it's a win-win situation, because at worst I'll find out that maybe I wasn't being clear. So this is a good edit. And at best I can actually, like, I am being clear and I'm articulating it, or, in a way, I'm defending it in a way that makes me believe in it more, and I will go tooth and nail over the smallest things. I did a piece for Freeze recently about the Magic Castle in Los Angeles. And I said pubes, and they wanted to change it to pubic hair. And I went and I was like, no. I just feel like
why?
This is a long side note, but
I'm trying to imagine being the editor going back and forth on emails.
The copy editor, because my pubes, my choice. And the reason why I'm talking about my pubic hair in review is another discussion. But I think there's a lot of givens in art criticism, and I think there's a lot of givens that are, and they tend to be a little bit conservative. They tend to veer toward academic language, which I think is I'm not anti-academic language at all. I think it's incredibly, I think the whole cloth blowback against complex or academic language is not productive either. But especially, I mainly write for, a mainstream sort of generally public interest publication. And one of the things that I retained early on was an editor telling me about being very explicit or very discerning about a use of Latinate diction versus Anglo-Saxon diction, which meaning like using a fancy TION word like copulation instead of, or sex, which is like
gotten away with it
it's just a way of, for me, I think was important because I didn't come from academia. It was a way to check my diction, and that, like, am I just using the big word because I want to use the big word, or am I using the word that's the strongest and most communicative? And so I came from because I had maybe a tendency to try and use big words not in a not very discerning way. I'm always like using the shortest possible word that could fit what I'm trying to say or what I'm trying to communicate, that could even fit the work. And it just seemed like, and in making a talking about the sort of discipline of magic as this campy mainstream sort of essentially non-art practice, I think the point I was trying to make was about magic being almost this practice that kind of tries to make the body disappear, because it's a lot of work to do these sort of impossible things, and contrasting that in terms of what a lot of contemporary art about the body does. I just felt it was important to say pubes if I'm talking about my body or the artist's body. And maybe this is part of me making it too personal. The fact that they wanted to change it to pubic hair was like, just felt like this, a little bit of distancing in a way that was against the point I was trying to make about immediacy. And I will put all of that in an email just to be able to use the word pubes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm on the other end. This is
I know,
why
I love that we're so opposite.
Perfectly constructed panel, because we are the yin and the yang. So
Just thinking that, yeah.
I will not fight for a word change sentence structure, because you're like
aghast
first of all,
right
there's
now. host
styles, right? So there's host styles. An art form has a host style. So that is something I don't need to fight. How do I say this? First of all, as I was saying earlier, like, language is not natural to me. Writing is very difficult. So I will trust others. Thinking is very important. Analysis, interpretation, really believing in criticism and believing in criticality is hugely important. I don't need to be specific with it. And it has to do with identity, right? So my identity is, I am an artist and a professor. Like, that is a core, right? My relationship to writing, whether that's, and I do write a shitload of essays for artist catalogs, that is a kind of writing form that maybe is, that pulls back on judgment and criticality and questioning. It's context giving, very important. And so that is a form. So there's different forms of writing that I don't need to kind of fight, for pube, the same way. Like, so, it's just something that I'm not going to take the time doing. I'd rather take the time developing another analysis or another idea around the work than kind of wrestling style. I am styleless. I'm also humorless, as everybody can figure out. I'm not too convinced of that.
But that's not true at all. But it's funny. I love that you bring that up, because some of my performance work has been called antagonistic, which I like to think of it as play, and there is discernment. I find that, deconstruction is not like a whole cloth, blast it all down. I think there's very a lot of what I do is deconstructionist, and I think there's a time and a place. So same, and just for me, the areas where it's important to fight versus where it's important to let the house style take over is absolutely part of the writing practice. It just comes up in different places. And, and I will say also, I think, talking specifically about art form or places that have very strong house style, it's not that I, blasted in, first review saying like, you let me say pubes or I'm out. I learned the house style. I feel like there's sometimes when younger writers ask, like, how do you do this stuff or get away with it? I wasn't trying to get away with anything for a very long time. I took a lot of time to learn the house style, to learn the conventions, and then it became part of the practice later to just think about, where are these, and that's part of the philosophy basically of play that I study as a clown, and I have studied as a professional clown, which is that, everything is same. It's a historical materialist thing, right? It's just coming at it from a different viewpoint. It's like all the rules are made up. This is all made up. Everything is up for grabs. And, there's a point at which you deconstruct everything and the whole structure falls down. But there's also being very thoughtful, or what I would consider playful, about where am I pushing back that's going to actually be in service to like the greater purpose that like what I'm doing is supposed to do, and where are we getting caught up in conventions also for no reason.
And speaking of that purpose, I mean, do you ever get caught up in, that idea of accessibility? Because I have a lot of friends that, not that I'm like sticking my reviews in front of their faces, but they don't read art criticism. And I think there is just a prevalent idea that it is unaccessible. And to a point, yeah, it is. It is, thick with jargon. Do you ever, when you're working on your own reviews, try to think like, how do I make this accessible? Like, do you try to catch yourself like you were saying earlier about the vocab you're using?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that quite quickly. And my obligation is to the work, and my obligation is to assessing it. It's the how and the what. Sure. And that is what I'm obligated to. Audiences will come and go. So I'm not really thinking about an audience. And you know how it is. You can, I've been writing for Art Forum where I do reviews for the most part for a very long time. And, issues will come and go, and you will never hear that somebody read that piece. Nobody will say, including the artist or the gallery. Right?
Only if they're mad.
So you don't do that. I don't do it for those reasons. Yep.
I guess for me, it's just a more logistical question of like what outlet I'm writing for and what and what the readership is. So publications that focus only on contemporary art are going to have a given body of knowledge that the readership has. But I also started writing for the reviews for the Los Angeles Times a few years ago, which is a general interest newspaper. And so that was a very interesting transition because there are certain conventions of also writing about art for a general interest audience. And it just means sort of unpacking references or defining your terms a little bit more. I think I said something like studio-based process in a review, and the editor highlighted it and said explain. I was like, oh, it was actually very helpful to think about the terms that we take for granted in talking to like an art audience. But the only time it's the most stressful is when I'm actually writing for myself, and I'm working on I wrote a small book of essays about art a few years ago, and I'm working on another one. And it's almost harder to think about how I want to talk about this stuff when there is no editor or sort of house style or reader to sort of bounce that off of.
Do you find yourself writing differently?
Oh, yeah. I hope so, because I hope that would be sort of the purpose of me sort of writing these books, not necessarily for an academic press or for a publication. For better or worse, I fell into art criticism and I really fell in love with it. And it's still a big part of how I think and write in general. So the book I'm writing now is supposed to be a memoir about becoming a comedian. And I'm finding that a lot of the work is still being told or thought through like art encounters. So at the end of the day, it's like this stuff, it has to, does it make my life better? And the answer is yes. And so it's worth giving it that due diligence.
You mentioned earlier about being called, antagonistic? And I was just wondering, do you usually read reviews? Do you? And if so, what's that like?
Reviews of our own work?
Yes.
Reviews of the exhibitions that we curate.
Of your own work? Yeah.
Yes, and there hasn't been many, but I don't know. To me, I think the curiosity, I won't read YouTube comments, but I'll read any review of my work. I can at least expect that even if it's negative or I don't agree with it, that there is a level of thought that went into it that doesn't go into other types of more offhand commentary about what I do. It is interesting. It was very helpful or interesting for me to suddenly see a lens on my work that I had been putting on other people's work, and how even if it's a valid point of view or maybe a correct point of view, that it could be different from what I intended to do or make. And that honestly helped me not loosen up a little bit as a critic myself, that there's, the work that I like the most. Art should, I hope, leave room for interpretations that are not, even if they're in conflict, that can all be sort of justified by the work. So it did make me think about if I think I'm doing, and the word antagonistic has come up several times, which is not something I would ever have thought that I was doing or intended to do. And it did make me wonder, is that something that needs is that going to affect, how I go about it?
Do you disagree with that?
Absolutely. But I think that's part of the risk of making work, especially in the context of performance. I think to view play as antagonism is also just a very interesting conflict. And I think I don't know if it's going to be solvable by me trying a different approach or by someone else viewing participation in a different way. It's, I guess ultimately, it becomes a lot of food for thought, but ultimately I cannot let it change what I do.
So I have had some interesting run-ins.
That was a
criticism on the work, including the famous Ken Johnson review in the New York Times calling me a soccer mom. And that basically ran him out of the paper. There was enough kind of pushback with that. We've become friends over the years, but but that was uncomfortable, and it was a misread. We don't need to go into that.
So that sounds just like an insult instead of a critique.
Yeah, did you take it? I mean,
that's a personal
as an
comment.
I remember reading it in kind of being frozen for about 2 days. It was rough, and this was it was James Cohan, which is a pretty nice gallery in New York City, and it was my first exhibition with him, so that was rough. But then on the other hand, both for the Whitney Biennial in 2014 and then Front International in Cleveland, both of which I curated with some help. The amount of criticism, the amount of reportage, the amount of journalism that comes from exhibitions like that is extraordinary.
Do you read it all?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But I think in aggregate, it becomes absurd. Right. There are some, I will always remember Helen Mosworth's review of the biennial because she was talking about sightlines. And I remember thinking that when I was installing the 4th floor of the Breuer building, that sightlines were very important. So she was pushing back at those sightlines. So that was an interesting thing to kind of wrestle with. It was actually very, very practical. And then there was, and then I can go on with exhibitions like this. These are iconic exhibitions in terms of who gets first shot, who gets first access to kind of putting it through the meat grinder. But yes, I think when one starts to see the full scope of it, it all starts to become a little fraudulent. I do remember John Yao wrote also a piece of the Whitney Biennial. He was actually doing a kind of a counting of Asian artists who participated in the biennial, and he literally miscounted. And I remember kind of pushing back at him, and we don't talk to this day. That was a mistake on my part. You accept that. So yes, I don't. If some things are misinterpreted or some things are just erroneous, I'm not. Again, it's a little bit like correcting sentence structure or language. I've learned pretty quickly not to correct the record because there's no record to correct, quite honestly. It's
even if it's just numbers.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I remember going back and forth. I was teaching at Bard that summer, and it's like, no, Victoria Wu was in. I was going back and forth, but it was wrong. It was not an argument to be had.
Do you find as a curator you're more protective over?
Maybe yes. I think excellent point. Yes, because I am feeling like I am protecting the artist in the show, right? And not so much myself as curator. But I want to say my little back and forth with John may have been I think it was a pissing contest. But yes, yeah. So I do read them. But again, for those exhibitions that come in masse, it almost becomes comical, like what comes in next. And, as we all are reading the reviews coming out for the current Whitney Biennial, whiplash. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. With a commentary on the doll, but for the most part, whiplash.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I will read anything that someone writes about my work, but I feel like I've never been moved to, even if there's something I disagree with, I've never been moved to engage somebody or contradict them because, at the end of the day, their relationship with my work is none of my business. That's, I think, how I feel. And I'm kind of honestly just grateful that somebody's out there thinking about it critically, because a lot of my practice starts outside the art world, which is as stand-up comedy. And then it gets sort of, and then it turns out when you do stand-up comedy in a museum, they call it performance art. And then someone wants to write about it on those terms. So to me, it's just sort of this exercise in contextualization that is that's the machinations of the art world doing what it does. And in that instance, it's not really part of what I'm doing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you ever have to catch yourself thinking like, don't take it so seriously? I don't want to ask that since you're a comedian,
I don't
but...
take it's at the same time, even as a comedian, now that I'm a professional comedian, it's fine that I started doing stand-up comedy as a way to escape the gravitas on the art world, and then that became my job. And I'm like, and then actually stand-up comedy is a dead serious profession in its own right. So it's the tension of it's dead serious and all made up at the same time. I think Italo Calvino, one of the last series of lectures he gave before he died, gave a whole lecture on the idea of lightness and work. He uses to talk about a lot of different artworks that he loved, but the idea of holding heavy things lightly, I think, is pretty central to how I create and also how I write. Sure. And not in a way that, diminishes or does a disservice to things that are heavy, but I think that's part of the discipline of play, I guess. Mm-hmm. I will say one of the first review I ever got was for a performance that I did at Red Cat, and it was a late night style talk show, and I got an email from Extra saying to please hold some tickets for this person who was going to come to review the show. And I was actually afraid because this was my first time that my work was going to be reviewed as art, not like, and I received some press from more like entertainment or general interest publications, but I was honestly a little bit afraid of seeing if what I did outside of the art world what it would be considered sort of within that context. And so what I did, because it was the performance was a talk show, without telling the reviewer, in the middle of the show, I put his name up really huge on the screen, and I said to come down. I was like, our next guest doesn't know that they're a guest, but they're reviewing the show, so let's hope that they're here. And I put his name up on the screen. I wish I had a picture of it. And so I made, as part of the performance, I made the critic reviewing the show come down in the middle of the show and tell everyone how it was going.
Wait, did they know that they
didn't know?
How did they take that?
He took it really well, and someone asked, what, and it's actually, comedy, and what I do is complicated. So I had to tell the house, like, this is what I'm going to do, and Red Cat are used to performance art being a very tight thing, and I think comedy inherently has to leave some room for failure and error. So it's, in the sense, it was extremely choreographed because they had to have different cues light cues depending on how this person reacted, which is something that we couldn't have predicted, and I felt like was very important not to know.
How did they react?
They had a great time. He mostly just laughed and giggled because there was also other comedians on stage sort of asking him about it. And that was the sort of idea of the show. I mean, it was the work is called Aesthetical Relations, which is obviously a pun on relational aesthetics. So I mean, it's kind of, it was a big risk. And I think people sometimes, what I was afraid of was being viewed that was just being reckless, when it's actually, I'm like, these risks are very calculated. And I had several different options for depending on what that person's reaction was. He came up and he was a very good sport about it. I had options for if some reason he didn't show up or if he wasn't there. I had different light cues for if he was into it or not. I had a plant in the audience who was going to volunteer to be like the alternate critic if that person actually didn't show up. There's a lot of hidden work that goes into that kind of quote unquote seemingly spontaneous or reckless thing, which it was spontaneous. It just, in order to make it work either as art or a piece of entertainment, there's a lot of calculation that has to happen. I mean, it's the line, I guess, is for me, I intentionally just, sometimes I very intentionally just sort of step over or pretend that line isn't there.
Sure. We have been speaking about these, you mentioned Art Forum, these established, as you say, quote unquote, serious magazines. Do you do any work with alternative publications? And if so, is what you produce different?
what is an alternative art publication? I mean, we
I guess
all
we've been
agree
seeing, I guess in the past, I was the second I said, I was like, Mom, I have to clarify. Like, like in the past few years, like I think you've been seeing more blogs, more
Mhm.
on Instagram, like things like, I'll just say it again, the White Cube, smaller, more,
Mhm.
I kind of don't like the word grassroots, but things that have a different idea of, say, it's again, accessibility.
I would say it's very tricky because part of what makes um, an art publication have the power that it does is a certain, frankly, just history or just being around for a long time. So I think alternative publications or artist-run publications, almost like artist-run spaces, necessarily have a limited lifespan. And I know for artists who, being on just the critic end of it, and having written about a lot of emerging or younger artists, the pressure that some artists feel to have been talked about in a publication that they are confident will exist in 5 or 10 years is huge. But actually, I like that you mentioned the White Cube. I think it's one of the few like grassroots or alternative blog publications that has really, really worked. But I think, there's a lot of, critics who've started Substacks or podcasts or meme accounts. And I think that is really valid, but it's kind of inherently a almost like a solo or a smaller endeavor. Sure. So it's not like and it's a lot of work that I haven't felt compelled to do, or start my own blog or start my own art, Substack. So it's sort of and it's not like I'm gonna write for someone else's. I think the most successful alternative publications usually are like a 1-person or a 2-person operation that kind of, and they grow because that person is developing a very specific voice. They're developing like a house style of 1 or a house style of 2, and that kind of necessarily, prevents building, what is the traditional model of like an editorial team or like a team of freelancers. And I don't know if there's a value judgment there. I just think it's the grassroots publishing is inherently a more individual endeavor.
Yes, and I would say the answer is no, because of exactly what you said, Christina, that it is singular. It is about somebody's assessment of oneself, right? And that identity gets played into whatever and however they're thinking about and what they're reviewing or what is being talked about. So I resist that. I have to say, back in the day, and the day being the 80s and the 90s, there were little publications that would circulate, particularly in Chicago. There was Chicago Art Right, there was Art Muscle. There were many of these small publications in which I cut my teeth on before I kind of jumped to Freeze and Art Forum and the kind of national, international publications. But they're not in print form anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that is the sad thing that's missing. Because I did, I got my start at, Art Slant or Art Practical or smaller regional publications that were then the jumping points. Yeah, like Freeze, Art Forum, ARTnews, our blessed sponsor, and that's what's the thing that worries me most about art publishing is that level doesn't exist, and I don't know if there's a path for the kind of like hyper individualized art blog, like personality driven, and trust. So much of what I do is personality driven, and yet I still don't see blogs as being like blogs or the current hyper individual grassroots publications as being a bridge to larger publications. That's also to say maybe people don't care about that hierarchy anymore, or it's less of has less of a chokehold on people writing in the way it used to.
I mean, I think it definitely is like you were mentioning, those like smaller regional publications. I mean, to have them shutter, I think is a huge loss for art writers. Like, ARTnews, I also work across Art in America. We have Art Forum in the building, and we're in New York. And, I have family there, so it doesn't cost whatever to have moved there, to be there. But it is, I think, like I said, like a loss to being able to jump from regional to these kind of larger ones. And
there's not a parallel
issue.
It's so many people who got into art writing, we come in through the side door one way or the other, through being an artist or just walking in or something. But I don't see I'm not sure. I'm not even making a value judgment. This is a good or a bad thing, but I don't see someone, especially an art writer who doesn't. It's a type of writing that you don't work with editors, and obviously, like working with editors either by going with them or fighting them is a huge part of my criticism practice. So to sort of, I don't see if like, let's talk about Manhattan Art Review or like White Cube. If you get to the point that's you have your own huge audience and you're very used to building criticism outside of the system of working with an editor, that's not really a bridge to that kind of publishing. And if if the publication is that big on its own, is that bridge even desirable? Sure. And I'm not sure. And there's apparently very, it's the same as like, if I've become this big on TikTok, am I going to be an actor? I think that's not necessarily a clear enough bridge as there used to be between different contexts.
So I think I just got the signal that we're about to move into the Q&A. So I just wanted to ask one last question about economics. Can you just talk briefly, or as comfortably as you want to, just I guess what it costs to do what you do, how it's viable?
You don't do it for a paycheck.
That's
short of it. Yes. Yes.
I do.
Okay, she does.
Right now it is, at some point, I think, because I built my art writing practice through having full-time, like while also having full-time day jobs. And it's just been in the past, I'd say like 2 years that I've been a full-time artist and writer, which is very interesting. Because I think there is a period with any practice. Stand-up comedy is the same, art writing is the same, where I was just happy to learn and figure it out. And at some point, and as someone who doesn't teach, I think the day job thing had become a bigger question. And I think I meet a lot of, and at some point I realized, because I did really want to develop the art writing without any potential conflicts of interest, I made it a point to take on day jobs that were completely outside of the art world. And I know that's different from a lot of younger writers who either work at a gallery or a museum or teach. I wanted to focus on just that. So I had a lot of experience in the tech industry. And I actually I don't know. I think day jobs are unavoidable for most writers. And I was very happy to do something that was completely separate. And I think it gave me a lot of focus. So I think for 10 years, I was maybe not hustling or publishing as much as other writers who I knew wanted to be like full-time writers right away. But the body of work that I made, it was much prouder of, because I had to be a little bit more precious with my time and discerning about what I could give my attention to. I think that eventually served me being at the point where I don't, have a day job right now. And, it's like when I say I do it for the paycheck, I mean that in sort of a literal sense, that sort of freelance writing is a big part of my income. So I do tend to, at this point in my career, veer toward places that can like value what I do. And that has meant going honestly a little bit beyond the scope of just the art publication, which is kind of exciting, because I really enjoy doing criticism for a wider audience.
Cool. Are we Q&A-ing? Yeah. Okay, I'll stop yapping.
Hi, I was wondering about times in your career when you've been better known as an artist than a writer, or vice versa, better known as a writer than an artist, and how you navigate that.
That's an excellent question. I would have to say Chicago needs me to be a writer. There's not enough criticism here. And there's plenty of artists. So I've seen that happen over the years. Same thing with curating. You throw that in any kind of given community, any kind of institution you're involved with, whatever is necessary, whatever is pragmatic is what you are framed with. What that does is it gives you a lot of cover for then your studio practice, right? So I was able to really be in the city for quite a long time, known as the person who runs an exhibition space, or as the person who's the writer, who's a critic, gives a lot of cover to the work. So you have to play that. You can't be resentful of it because it's really obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, I have been. I was exclusively a writer for at least 5 or 7 years before I started doing any other kind of work. So um, there's been a very big shift I've noticed, and I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and that's where I'm based. In people's reactions to me now that I am also in the same boat. I think when I identified purely as a writer, everyone was much nicer to me. And I have felt that a little bit of tension around still fielding lots and lots and lots of inquiries and sometimes outright entreaties to write about people's work or write about certain exhibitions. And I mean, that's how a lot of that's a big part of how a freelance writer will find things to write about. But I've had to, it's more of a logistical concern around creating boundaries around my writing practice to give space to every other part of my practice. And sometimes that's also just different forms of writing.
Hey, and I want to follow up on that because there's something I'm thinking about outside of my first response about whatever the city needs you to do is how they will shape you, right? But what's interesting about this is, again, as I was saying, Chicago doesn't need another artist; it needs a critic. It needs you to be that. That is what pulled me outside of this city. I mean, this is a city in which it's very hard for even the best artist who comes out of grad school here, sticks around, has their show at the MCA, even has a decent commercial gallery here in the city, still can't find their way to New York or LA. Writing pulled me out of this city, right? So that was relationships to the shows that I was writing, the curators who were reading those reviews. That was a way and much more fluid in terms of moving around the world than being yet another Chicago artist. That's just reflecting on that. Now the strategy seems to, I can see it. That's not why I did it, but it is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think you had a question. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. So I had two questions, and you can answer both or either. Do you have a reader in mind? Like, is it yourself, or do you have like a friend or colleague that's kind of the ideal reader? And also, do you think criticism is changing or has changed in the last couple of years since COVID at all, or is it just a continuum? Thanks.
Yeah, I have some ideas here. Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. I am not buying her theory in 2024. It's an amazing piece, but what she sets up is the other to that. So right now, that deep interrogation, that going down, that again, pulling, and in her case, maybe damaging, that needs to happen right now. We have really flipped on that. Different times, different places. And so I would encourage you all to read Against Interpretation, but think about it as the flip. And then the other question, what was the second part to your question? It was
about the reader.
Yeah. I'm looking at Atticus right now. I'm reading a really it's a book called Immediacy, and it's really looking at how that has impacted culture. It's literary criticism. Anna Kornblau, who's at the University of Illinois, wrote that text. So I'm doing a lot of translation. Again, I will always point you to literary criticism and make you obligated, ask you to translate forms of literature into, the equivalents within contemporary art. It's much more helpful than any kind of critical reader right now in the arts.
I'd say my ideal reader is me, because I read a lot. I read a lot for pleasure. I read a lot as every part of my practice, and I think that if I like something, it's a pretty good indication that it can work. And oh gosh, things changing since the pandemic. I would absolutely agree with what you're saying, Michelle. And I don't know, as someone who has erred, I don't even want to say err as if that was an error, but it was leaned very much on the side of like, narrating on description, narrating a personal experience of a personal aesthetic experience being a part of description, the erotics of art. It's almost, it can very easily, fall into like, we're not really talking about the work. We're talking about feelings about the work, which, the art critic, Michael Baxendahl, I think many decades ago, basically said that, yeah, you actually can't describe of a painting. You can only describe feelings you have about actions that were made in the past, which is like, so in a way it's inescapable. And I also have gotten a little more because I think that type of writing is just so prevalent across all types of publishing right now. But I do also have I have confidence in my writing that way, because I just because I've been writing about art for 12 years, and I have internalized a certain history and context that I think doesn't totally go out the window if I write about, a feeling, as opposed to maybe someone who doesn't write about art, who wants to write about feelings.
I think we're at time.
Oh, it's
We're gonna do one more.
One more?
What do you want?
So at the beginning of our discussion, your panel discussion, you talked about kind of how futile it was to be completely objective in writing about art. So I'm just curious to hear the stakes that are at play when it comes to art criticism, if it's impossible to be objective. And there's some of us that's in our review and in our criticism. That's a good question. Who wants to take it?
I think it is impossible. I think that what is calibrated as objectivity is itself like a historical construction within the context of, or I would say even the vacuum of like the art world, this system. And I think the best we can do is to be sort of upfront about that awareness, or upfront. I think Dave Hickey, who, for better or worse, is one of my favorite art critics, he did mention that he said something about that being personal is almost being personal, subjective in his work is a way of striving toward objectivity, because he's putting all of his cards on the table. He said, like, my subjectivity is about trying to be as open as possible about my prejudices, so that there can be at least a great more possibility for some kind of objectivity. I think, but again, it's sort of it's a fine line. I'm trying to circle that square of how can I be aware or proactive about my prejudices, my point of view coming in, versus what's the point at which I'm just writing about my feelings. And I think that's just the tension for me, and maybe for a lot of critics, that you're holding the tension between those opposites.
Yeah, I would say my voice is absolutely uninteresting, and I don't need to bring my voice to any kind of critical assessment of any kind of work. I do have to make decisions in terms of how do I contextualize? What are the contexts that I'm using to look at this work, to kind of come to understand that work? And I'm trying to, I have to make that decision about which of that kind of framing do I want to bring to that work that will help us understand not only the work itself, but maybe also generate the questions, important questions we need to ask in culture now. And that is my goal. So I come at it with questions, but from a kind of hopefully just it's not objective, but a kind of cultural position. And I really do try to I suppress a voice as far as possible. And I bring forward, and with, again, as we were talking about, understanding bias now, understanding why I'm always talking about Hal Foster, understanding why people come to the fore. But there is a lot of really interesting theory and criticism happening right now in all kinds of disciplines. And so I go there, right? So I'm letting leaders in the field really kind of guide me and help me think through how I then can kind of break down and assess what I'm looking at. And some of that is the poetic, which I have the hardest time writing about. I'm writing an essay for an exhibition that's opening at Good Weather tomorrow, and it really speaks to the poetic. I know the work, but that is that's a little trickier for me because again, when you have a command of have a command of language, you can start playing with the poetic literally in the form itself. So that's where I struggle, but that's just technical.
I think that's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.